So far, we've gone over the ways in which we can select objects simply by clicking on them when the Select and Move and Select and Rotate tools are active. We can access the Select and Move tool by pressing the letter W on our keyboard. And likewise, we can access our Select and Rotate by pressing the letter E on our keyboard. Either one of these will allow us to select any object simply by clicking on it. We can select multiple objects by holding down Control and selecting different objects at once. And we can subtract from the selection by holding down Alt and clicking on an object that has already been selected. This is one way in which we can manage selections. There are other ways, of course. I'll press Alt W to maximize the current view. We can access the Select Object tool by clicking on this icon or pressing the letter Q. Now, once I've pressed the letter Q, the Select Object tool is active and I can now select my object. But the way in which I can select it is determined by several other factors. One of these is the manner in which we can make the selection. Currently it's set to rectangular selection region, which means that we can left click and drag to draw out a rectangle, and whichever objects are encompassed within the volume of that rectangle are going to be selected. Now, if I click on the letter Q several times, you'll see that this icon is going to change and it's going to go through different methods of the Select Object tool. So the first one I've selected is the rectangular selection region, and the second one is the circular selection region. And we can use it by left clicking in the middle and then dragging out to draw out a circle, which is going to determine our selection region. Pressing Q again goes into the fence selection region, which allows us to click and hold, then click, click again, to draw out a more complex shape, which can be used to select objects. Pressing Q yet again enters the lasso selection region, and pressing Q yet again enters the paint selection region, which I can use simply by left clicking and holding and then dragging out over any objects that I want to select. There is no right or wrong way to use any of these, and there is no one perfect tool that works in all situations. You should try and work with all of these different tools in different situations, and some might work better in a certain situation, while as others might work better in another situation. We can also use the Select by Name tool, and the shortcut for that is simply pressing the letter H. If we press the letter H or click in the Select by Name tool, it's going to show us all of the visible objects in our scene, and we can now select any one of these by selecting them by their name. Now, the problem here is that we haven't named our objects accordingly, and just to make sense of all of this and to make them easier to select, we can rename them. It's a good idea to always rename all objects that you create. Instead of having default names like Box 1 or Box 2 or Box 29, it's always a good idea to give them a specific name so that you can know which object is which if you're using the Select by Name or Selecting Scene or any other tool that uses names. So I'm going to rename this green box into green box. I'll rename the blue box as well, and I'll rename the pink pyramid. So now if you press the letter H, a Select from Scene window is going to open up, and we can see that we have our blue box, green box, and pink pyramid, and we can select one, press OK, or we can select several of them by holding down Control. We can detract any object from a selection by holding down Alt and clicking on it, or we can select a range of objects by clicking on first, holding down Shift, and clicking on the last. Any object that we select can be hidden, frozen, or isolated. Now, what does all of that mean? Well, let's say that we're working in a scene and some of our objects are getting in the way. We perhaps don't want to see them while we're working on other objects, or perhaps we don't want to accidentally select them, move them, or modify them in any way. This is usually the case when you're modeling out a room and you've created all the walls, but then you want to model out all the furniture that's inside the room and the walls keep getting in the way. You can hide these walls, or any other object by that matter, by simply selecting an object, right-clicking anywhere in the scene so that the quad menu pops up, and just going to hide selection. Now you can see that the object is hidden. I can no longer see it. And if I press H or select from scene, you can see that my green box is nowhere to be found. I can only select the blue box or the pink pyramid. I can hide more objects if I want. So if I want to hide the pink pyramid, I'll just left click on it, right click, and go to hide selection. Now only my blue box is visible. If I want to unhide all of my objects in the scene, I can just right click and click on unhide all, which is going to unhide all of the objects that are in my scene, or I can click on unhide by name, which is going to open up a special dialog showing all of the hidden objects in the scene, and I can select which ones I want to unhide. In this case, I want to unhide all of these. So now all of my objects are visible. Freezing objects, on the other hand, keeps the objects visible inside the scene, but it makes them unselectable and unmodifiable. So you work with the freeze object option if you want a specific object to be visible inside your scene, but you don't want to accidentally select it, move it, or modify it in any way. Freezing works quite similarly to hiding objects. You just select an object, or several objects for that matter, right click, and go to freeze selection. Now these objects, even though they're visible, cannot be selected, cannot be modified. If I press H to go into the select from scene tool, you'll see that only my blue box is going to be visible, and we'll only be able to select it. We won't be able to select the green box or the pink pyramid. Now you might be wondering why these two objects are grayed out. Why didn't they retain their original color? By default in 3D Studio Max, frozen objects are grayed out, but you can change that. First of all, however, we need to unfreeze them in order to change the way in which they're displayed once they're frozen. So I'm going to right click and just click on unfreeze all to unfreeze all objects. Now I can select one or more objects, right click, and go to Object Properties. In here, you'll see a specific option that says Show Frozen in Gray, and by default this one is checked. You can uncheck that option and press OK, and then freeze the object, or we can freeze them right here in the Object Properties window. Now these two objects, even though they didn't change in their appearance, we can still see their ID colors. We cannot select them, we cannot modify them in any way, and if we press H to go into the select from scene view, only the blue box, which isn't frozen, can be selected. We'll unfreeze these objects by right-clicking anywhere in the scene and clicking on Unfreeze All. There is another method for selecting objects in the scene, and that's using the Scene Explorer. We can access the Scene Explorer by clicking on this Toggle Scene Explorer button. It's going to open a new window that's quite similar to the Select in Scene window. But there is a difference, and I'll show you what it is in a second. If I select any specific object and hide it, or freeze it, there's going to be a difference in which these objects are going to be displayed in the Select by Name dialog and the Scene Explorer. So let's go ahead and check how that works. I'm going to select my blue box and freeze it. And then I'm going to select my pyramid and hide it. So now I can only select this green box while the other objects are unselectable and the pyramid isn't even visible. If I press H to go into the Select in Scene or Select by Name window, I can only select the green box. However, if I go into the Scene Explorer, you can see that I can see my blue box, my green box, and my pink pyramid. So one of the differences between the Scene Explorer window and the Select by Name or Select in Scene dialog window is that the Scene Explorer window displays all objects regardless of whether they're frozen or not, and regardless of whether they're visible or not. Not only that, but the Scene Explorer allows us to directly freeze or unfreeze objects by clicking on this snowflake icon right here, as well as allowing us to show or hide specific objects by clicking on the eye icon next to the name of the object. Now that's the reason why I prefer working with the Scene Explorer window instead of working with the Select by Name window, even though sometimes it may be useful to use the Select by Name window simply because it has less objects to view from if some of them are frozen or if some of them are hidden. Another quite useful functionality in 3ds Max is the Isolate Selection option. To demonstrate that, I'm going to unhide and unfreeze all objects. So unhide all, unfreeze all. If I have one or more objects currently selected, let's say I'm going to select just one, in this case, let's say the pink pyramid, I can go into the Isolate Selection mode by clicking on the Isolate Selection toggle button. So once I press that, only the currently selected object or objects becomes visible and all of the others become invisible. Now I can go back into the state where everything is visible either by clicking on the Isolate Selection toggle again or by right-clicking and clicking on Unhide All. There is a shortcut for the Isolate Selection toggle, and the shortcut is Alt-Q. However, Alt-Q only allows me to go into the Isolate Selection mode, but pressing Alt-Q again doesn't exit the Isolate Selection mode. Now that's something that I usually like to change when I'm working in 3ds Max, because I like the Alt-Q shortcut to work as a toggle, which means I press it once, it goes into the Isolate Selection mode, and I press it again, it goes out of the Isolate Selection mode. So how do we change or how do we modify shortcuts? Well, it's actually quite easy, and it's something that I would advise everyone to do. So whenever you find a specific function that you use often or that you find useful, it's a really good idea to go ahead and create the shortcut if it doesn't exist, or learn it if it does exist, or you can modify it if it's not to your preference and you would like to have it set up a different way. The way you could go about that is going to Customize and then clicking on Customize User Interface. Now what we want is to change a keyboard shortcut, and the one we want to change is the Isolate Selection toggle. Now the thing is that currently the Alt-Q shortcut is used for another function, and that's just entering the Isolate Selection. So let's go over here and find the Isolate Selection toggle. So I'm going to click on any one of these actions and just press the letter I and find the Isolate Selection toggle. Okay, here we are. So currently the Alt-Q shortcut is assigned to the Isolate Selection, but what we want is to assign the same shortcut to the toggle button. The difference is that by default, pressing Alt-Q enters the Isolate Selection mode, but doesn't exit it if we press Alt-Q again. The toggle, however, works as an on and off switch. So pressing Alt-Q once goes into Isolate Selection, pressing Alt-Q again exits the Isolate Selection mode. So what I want to do is click on the Isolate Selection toggle, go into the hotkey, and press the shortcut that we want, which is Alt-Q. It's going to say that it's currently assigned to the Isolate Selection action, but we don't have a problem with that. We'll just reassign it by clicking Assign. And you'll see that the Alt-Q is now assigned to the Isolate Selection toggle and not the Isolate Selection, which means that if we select any object, press Alt-Q, goes into the Isolate Selection mode, while pressing Alt-Q again, exits the Isolate Selection. We can also create a shortcut for the toggle Scene Explorer. Now, you may be wondering whether there is a shortcut for the toggle Scene Explorer right now, where you can check that as well. Just go into the Customize User Interface, and just search whether the action that we're looking for has a shortcut assigned to it. So the action we're looking for is the toggle Scene Explorer. I'm just going to press the letter T and scroll down. And here it is, toggle Scene Explorer. Currently, it doesn't have any shortcut assigned to it, and we can assign a hotkey or a shortcut for it by clicking on it, going into the hotkey, and let's say that for me a good one would be Ctrl-Alt-S. And we'll just click on Assign. And you'll see that this hotkey has been assigned to the toggle Scene Explorer. I can press Ctrl-Alt-S to go into the Scene Explorer, and then select any object, let's say the blue box, press Ctrl-Alt-S again to hide it, and now I can move this blue box if I wish. I can rotate it, or freeze it, or hide it. I can also freeze or hide it by again going into the toggle Scene Explorer, and just hide it by clicking on the eye icon next to its name, or freeze it by clicking on this snowflake icon.